Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be talking about exceptional children, understanding learning differences, and empowering your students. Just a little bit about ourselves. My name is Narinet Khemichyan, and I'm here with my colleague, Lily Rosenberg. We're both school psychologists, and we've worked in Glendale, California for the past 22 years, and we've served students from preschool through high school. It's a pleasure to present to you today on behalf of the Armenian American School Psychology Association, which we are proud to be a part of. Okay, so for the presentation objectives, today we'd like to talk about defining exceptional learners. We'd like to talk about the definition of a specific learning disability, strategies to support students with specific learning disabilities. We'd also like to talk about the definition of autism and strategies that you can use to support your students with autism. We'd also like to talk about the definition of intellectual disability and strategies to support students with intellectual disability. We'd like to start with a quote that says, "It takes someone special to teach someone special." We acknowledge that if you're here with us today, you're in a category of individuals who are passionate about helping others, you're empathetic about children, and you put their needs above yours. So we thank you for being that special person for our students. Before we look at specific strategies that are unique to children with special needs, the key is knowing and understanding your student. So regardless of the disability, the most important thing to keep in mind is that every child is unique. And if you want to be an effective teacher, an effective assistant, an effective school psychologist, you really need to know your students' strengths, understand their needs, understand the accommodations and modifications, and be able to implement them as needed in the classroom and in their school. So who are exceptional learners? The term exceptional refers to students who learn and develop differently from most other students who have different learning styles. So exceptional students are those who fall outside of the typical range of development. And although we're going to be concentrating on 3 categories today, there are 13 different eligibility categories in special education in America that students might fall under. And we hope that the strategies you learn today can be applied to a variety of different students with special needs around the world. As you can see, the data presented on this slide, it's pretty consistent in that majority of students in special education fall under the category of specific learning disability, followed by speech or language impairment, autism, and intellectual disability. So let's get started by first looking at the category of specific learning disability. And again, these are students with average cognition who struggle with academics. And Lily will talk more about the specifics involved.
Okay, so as you saw in the previous slide, learning disabilities are what impact the highest percentage of our students. 15% of the United States population, that's about 1 in 7 Americans, has some type of learning disability. According to our government regulations, students with learning disabilities have disorders in 1 or more basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, which may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. Now, learning disability is the condition that exists when a person's actual performance on achievement, on specifically achievement testing, is substantially below that expected for his or her established intelligence, age, and grade, which we determine through assessment. Okay. Now, our brains are extremely complicated, But if we had to break down what the brain must do in order for learning to take place, here are 3 steps. First is we get input. We're gathering information into our brain, primarily from our eyes and ears. Once that information has arrived, the brain needs to make sense out of it, a process called integration. Next, the information must be stored and then retrieved later, which is the memory process. And then finally, the brain must send some kind of message back to the nerves and the muscles. Okay, so we know from science that a learning disability is a neurological disorder, which is why you're seeing a picture of the brain and the parts of the brain. In simple terms, a learning disability results from a difference in the way a person's brain is wired. It is a processing difficulty, and any of the 5 senses may be impaired, often leading to one of these 4 prominent learning disabilities impacting math, writing, motor, or reading. Okay. Children with learning disabilities are as smart or smarter than their peers. They may have difficulty reading, writing, spelling, reasoning, organizing information if they are left to figure things out by themselves, or if they're taught in conventional ways. However, I want to restate this again. A learning disability has nothing to do with a student's intelligence. They do not correlate. Learning disabilities interfere with acquisition of skills, executive skills such as organization and time management, and they can affect social interaction and relationships with others. Here's a very short video on seeing dyslexia in a different way, which we will get into about what dyslexia is. I'm not going to play it right now, but I encourage you to take some time and just watch it. And there are so many resources on YouTube. It's just a fun little way of learning about dyslexia with this video when you have some time. Okay. Here is an example of a student with visual perceptual disabilities as part of a learning disability. Your student may have difficulty in organizing the position and shape of what he or she sees. Input may be received with letters, reversed or rotated. For example, an E might look like a 9, an E might look like a W, or a 3 or an M. So it's really important to figure out what not to do when you're teaching a student with a learning disability, regardless of their age. So one of these examples show us that we should not expect them to complete assignments as quickly as the rest of the class. Here is what we call a simulation. Okay, it's of what a student with dyslexia, which is a reading disability specifically, may see, since their brain is processing the letters in a different way. We talked about dyslexia, learning disabilities being a neurological disorder. So it's going to be very important to not ask your student with a learning disability to read aloud, or to read aloud when they're not expecting it or know that it's coming. It can lead to embarrassment, and it could lead to a sense of failure for them. It's important not to ask them to copy things from the board or text. This is a simple accommodation where you could have either your notes given to them so they can have it right next to them. That process of copying from the board can be very, very challenging for students with learning disabilities. One of the things that we can do, and is extremely important, as Nariné mentioned earlier, is to know your student. You have to know if they're a visual learner. Visual learners understand and remember things by seeing. Auditory learners retain information through hearing and listening. And kinesthetic learners retain information best by doing, not just reading, seeing, or hearing, actually moving. So I think it's important to take a moment right now. Think about yourself. What kind of learner, if we had to boil it down to these three, what category would you say your learning style falls into? So think about that. And actually in the resources that we will give you in these slides, at the end, there's a quick little self-test that you can do for fun to learn about your own learning style. Now, oftentimes we overlap and we use all different learning styles, but it's good to know what your strengths are. We all have varying degrees of visual, auditory, and kinesthetic preferences. Let's get into some learning techniques, or what we call strategies, on working on with kids with specific learning disability. The best part of this is that these strategies help all students. So you could do this with all students and they will specifically help with SLD students. Chunking information. Now, chunking information and material is one of the easiest ways to help because it's something we do every day. When you give someone your phone number, like the phone number listed here on the screen, you chunk. You provide it in a way that's easier to remember. We do it with many different information, including credit card numbers and such. So when you're breaking down bigger lessons, each block should reference material from previous ones, and you connect the concepts and utilize repetition. So that repetition is extremely important. For example, if students are asked to read a really long chapter for their homework, you can divide it into sections that are manageable. You chunk them. And at the end, with a task where the student summarizes what they're reading, their repetition portion of it is to reread each summary instead of the entire section. Many students with learning disabilities process information visually. So it's important to use those skills with comprehending lessons. For instance, after reading a chapter in a book, ask the student to draw a picture representing what they read, or ask students to close their eyes so they can picture what they have just learned. You can take advantage of visual organizers, such as the one shown here, to help students process their thoughts. There are so many visual organizers like this one available online. And we have some resources for you at the end of this slide that you can click on and find depending on what task you're doing. Audio-based learners. A person who is an auditory learner relies on speaking and listening as their primary way of learning. Many auditory learners may experience challenges when instructions or information are given in written form, but they can clearly understand them when the information is auditory, when you're talking to them. Additionally, your student learns by hearing others express what they have learned. So it's important to have other students talk about what they have learned as a way of repetition for these auditory-based learners. Next, we have kinesthetic learners. The critical point to note in kinesthetic learning is that stimulation is crucial to the process. Kinesthetic learners engage better when their body is alert and moving. They manage input better and they can process faster once their body is busy doing something besides focusing specifically on the material. With kinesthetic learning, individuals learn most effectively through physical movement. So when you're working with students, while you are both, maybe you can both be standing up, small movements to help focus, memorize by using fingers to write on the desk or in the air or on each other's back, use highlighters and flashcards, relaxation, role play, the list goes on and on. Just get creative. Nariné is going to now talk about a little bit more about autism.
Okay, thank you, Lily. So now let's take a look at a different group of exceptional learners who meet the eligibility criteria of autism. And here's the educational definition of autism that we follow in America. So as you can see on the slide, autism means a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction, generally evident before age 3, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Other characteristics often associated with autism are engagement in repetitive activities and stereotyped movements, resistance to environmental change or change in daily routines, and unusual responses to sensory experiences. So simply put, autism is a neurobiological condition that affects speech and language and social interactions. If you've worked in education for some time, chances are likely that you've worked with children with autism, because according to the CDC report in 2021, approximately 1 in 44 children in the United States is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, which we refer to as ASD. So some facts about autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Boys are 4 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls. ASD occurs across all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. Children born to older parents are at a higher risk for having ASD. And ASD can be reliably diagnosed as early as 2 years of age, although most are not diagnosed until after age 4. Okay, there's a quote about autism that says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. And this means that every child with autism is different and unique in their own way. So when you hear the word autism, you may think of the extreme, but autism is what we call a spectrum disorder. We used to actually think of the spectrum as a line. On one end of the continuum, we had kids who had severe needs, and on the other end of the line were kids with mild characteristics of autism. Currently, autism is described as a spectrum, as diverse as the rainbow you see in this picture. So it's not about being a little autistic or very autistic, but we look at which area of the brain is most affected in an individual on the spectrum to be able to come up with an appropriate educational plan. So in this color wheel, you'll see different areas for perception, motor skills, language, sensory processing, and executive functioning skills. Each person with ASD has different traits in these areas, but their brain might function typically in other areas. This is why autism can be so complex sometimes to diagnose, describe, and treat, because each individual is so uniquely impacted. So let's talk a little bit about their intellectual abilities. One of the significant differences we see is in their intellectual abilities. 31% are considered intellectually disabled. 25% are considered to be functioning in the borderline range. 44% function in the average to above average range. And so you can see most have average to above average cognitive functioning. And some of the typical characteristics of autism include poor social skills. We often see children with ASD struggle with interpersonal relationships. They have difficulty making eye contact or following along a conversation. They often want to interact with others, but may not know how to engage with friends, or they may be overwhelmed by the idea of new experiences. They struggle with communication. They often have emotional and behavioral challenges. They often present with unusual or narrow interests. They seek routine and need for sameness. They have sensory challenges, and they often under or overreact to sensory stimuli. And another typical characteristic in children with ASD is difficulty with executive functioning skills, which we will discuss more in a little bit. But first, theory of mind. It refers to our ability to understand what others are thinking or feeling. So we generally use our own experiences to guess what may be happening in someone else's mind. We're basically coming up with a theory of how someone else may be thinking or feeling. When we watch their reactions, it tells us how accurate or poor our assumptions are, and we make adjustments accordingly. But a lot of people with ASD appear unable to build this mental model of other people's minds. They can't imagine a brain that's not their own, one that doesn't have the same information, one with different motivations and feelings. They're unable to put themselves into someone else's shoes, and therefore they're unable to feel empathy, or sometimes even communicate effectively. So as you can imagine, this can make it really difficult to have a meaningful relationship with others. Communication challenges. So we know that one of the main challenges students with ASD face is in their verbal and nonverbal communication skills. It may take longer for students with ASD to process what's being said. They may take things very literally, and we see this often, and have difficulty with things like sarcasm. Sometimes it takes them longer to describe what they want, or they have a hard time clarifying ideas. Some may be nonverbal and require assistive technology devices to communicate. Some present with repetitive or rigid language. And sometimes they may say things that have no meaning or don't relate to the conversations they're having. They also struggle with poor nonverbal conversation skills. They're often unable to use gestures like pointing to an object to give meaning to their speech. They often avoid eye contact. To like an untrained eye to someone who's not a professional, it can make them seem rude, sometimes uninterested or inattentive. So because they're often misunderstood, they become frustrated in their attempts to make their feelings, thoughts, and needs known. Another characteristic we see is they often have narrow interests and exceptional abilities. They may be able to deliver an in-depth lecture or speech about a topic that holds their interest, but they struggle carrying on a two-way conversation, even if it's about the same topic. Interestingly enough, approximately 10% of children with ASD show savant skills, and these are extremely high abilities in specific areas such as memorization, calendar calculation, music, or math. Sensory processing disorder. This I really feel is one of the most important concepts to know if you're working with a student with autism. Sensory processing is the complex work that our brain does constantly to make sense of all the information that comes flooding in every second from your environment. The sensory processing system refers to the method the nervous system uses to receive, to organize, and to understand sensory input from the environment. And when sensory signals aren't organized into appropriate responses, this is what we call a sensory processing disorder, which our students with autism struggle with. It's when the body is unable to perceive, organize, or respond to stimuli appropriately. It's the inability to respond appropriately to ordinary experiences and when sensations are processed inefficiently. So let's take a look at the different sensory systems, because again, this is such an important piece to understanding our students with autism. The first is tactile processing, which is the ability to discriminate different types of touch. Second, we have auditory processing, and that's the ability to receive, discriminate, and filter sounds in order to understand them. Visual processing is the ability to identify and interpret visual stimuli. Proprioception defines the body's position in space, how we interact with the environment, and how much force we use when performing activities. It's your body's ability to sense movement, action, and location. For example, being able to walk or kick, without looking at your feet, or being able to touch your nose with your eyes closed. The next is the vestibular stimuli, and that impacts our reaction to gravity, movement, and balance. It's also known as the balance sense. It allows us to move smoothly. It's because of this sense that we're able to balance while we're engaged in other activities. The olfactory processing is the ability to identify and interpret smells. And the gustatory processing is how we interpret and experience tastes. So it's really important to understand the sensory system. So at this point, I'm sure you're wondering, okay, so how can I help in the classroom with a student who has autism? What we want you to do is we want you to be what we call a sensory detective. You should know your students so well that you can anticipate possible stressors or triggers. Establish a plan with your students' team. Provide calming activities that work specifically for your student. Offer opportunities for sensory input if they're seeking it. Use visual supports, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, and keep data on what works and what doesn't work, so you know what to do at a later time. So the following few slides are all about sensory challenges and recommended strategies to address them. In the first column, you'll see some signs that may indicate challenges in a specific sensory domain. And in the second column, you'll see the appropriate sensory diet is what we call it, or their recommendations to help address sensory needs. Each child should have a unique sensory diet that addresses their own unique sensory needs. Unfortunately, we won't have time to dive into each of these areas, but I did want to provide this information for you to reference in these slides. So for example, this particular slide is about visual sensory challenges and the recommended sensory diet for these challenges. On the next slide, we have auditory sensory challenges and some recommendations to address those needs. And the next one is tactile sensory challenges and the appropriate sensory diet for that. The next one is taste and smell sensory challenges. And the following is proprioceptive sensory challenges. They're outlined with some recommended strategies. And lastly, the vestibular challenges and recommendations on this slide. So take some time to review these on your own and think about some students that you work with and some strategies that you can use with them to address those specific processing needs. So as mentioned earlier, something that students with autism struggle with is executive functioning skills. So what are these skills? These include proficiency in adaptable thinking, planning, self-monitoring, self-control, working memory, time management, and organization. As you can see, these are all skills that are necessary to be successful in school. Here are some steps you can take to support your students struggling with these skills. I'm not going to go over all of them, but some things that you can do include having them repeat back the directions to check for understanding. And this is something very simple that can be done in class. Breaking down large chunks of work into smaller parts. Again, these are accommodations you can easily make in your classroom. Using graphic organizers with lots of visuals. If accessible and if it's appropriate, providing notes for lessons. Making sure that the student has their assignment written down and all necessary materials before they go home. So again, as a reminder, they have a very difficult time with organizational skills. And if they don't have their material with them to take home to do their homework, they're not going to be able to complete that task. Provide seating away from distractions because they're very easily distracted. Provide peer tutoring when possible with other students. Help them break down goals into manageable steps because they tend to get overwhelmed with an assignment. Limiting distractions. So let's look at some other challenges students with autism experience. Attention regulation is another difficulty that they have. They're easily distracted by things other students can ignore in the class. Some very common classroom distractions include conversations that are happening, classmates asking teachers for help, children running, screaming, and playing outside of the classroom window, intercom announcements. They can't tune out these distractions and focus on their assignment. Every time something distracts them, they're taken off task. So how you address this is based on the type of distraction that's taking place in the classroom. But be aware that this is an area that they struggle with. So for example, next slide, if your student is distracted by sounds and is overstimulated by them, the classroom with a high level of noise is going to be too much for them to handle. We generally offer these students earplugs or noise canceling headphones. They may also benefit from taking a quick walk outside to help them refocus. So it's important to know that the loud classroom setting might set these kids off. Calm corners. So if you're lucky enough to be in a classroom that has a calm corner or what we call a quiet corner, sometimes students with autism appreciate using the space to recenter and to calm themselves down. Sometimes the bright lights, the colorful artwork, and loud voices become too much for them to handle, and they need a quiet space to de-stress, regroup, and regulate themselves to be able to join the class again. Movement breaks. So another great strategy is the proven fact that exercise and movement breaks can regulate mood. So allow your student to stand up and stretch or take a quick walk outside of the classroom. Look for ways to scatter activities like simple exercises throughout the day. Children with autism can use exercise to regulate their difficult moods. Visual cues. Remember, as mentioned earlier, students with autism have communication deficits and can't express themselves effectively. This makes it hard for them to understand what's expected of them. You can create visual cues like flashcards with pictures for common requests, things like the common, command for listening, or sit at your desk and write. Take a break, and any other frequently used common request can be turned into a flashcard to be used as a visual cue. They may also be confused about what's happening or what activities to expect next, and visual supports can help with communication, and they can decrease problem behaviors because they limit the amount of anxiety that the student might be feeling if they know what to expect next. Next slide. A schedule is a key component of a visual support system. It's really important that children with autism have a visual schedule. They can be very powerful because they help these students visualize their activities. It gives the student information about what will happen and when it will happen, so they're not surprised. Remember, they like routine and they like sameness. They don't do well with surprises. When you use a visual schedule, you can use a picture to represent each task to help your student follow along as each item or task is completed. A schedule might include information about lessons, identifying when you'll discuss math, for example, geography, English, and so on and so forth. It can outline the breaks. You can specify when they will be having lunch, when lunch will begin, when it'll end, and outline any other break opportunities you offer in class so they can anticipate it and know that it's coming. Tests, for example, are important to have on that visual schedule. If you're giving a quiz or an exam, specify when it will begin and when it will end so we can limit surprises for them. And on the next slide, we have examples of some visual schedules that you can make for your student. And then the following slide Visual supports are really key in helping with behavior management. And behavior management is really a struggle for a lot of educators. If classroom rules or schedules aren't posted on the wall, create one for your student and keep it at their desk. You can also use daily visual reinforcement plans for self-monitoring. It's highly recommended that you provide immediate feedback using verbal or gestural cues. You can use token boards or behavioral contracts. If the classroom teacher permits, you may want to shorten assignments and decrease workload when necessary. And you can use cards with a list of coping strategies for your students to use when they're feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, or dysregulated. I want to remind you that these techniques and strategies can help all learners, not just students with autism. So next, let's take a look at students who have intellectual disabilities.
Okay, so what you see on the screen in this slide is the official educational definition of intellectual disabilities, or as we use the acronym ID in America. Children with intellectual disabilities, sometimes they're called cognitive disabilities, or we used to call it mental retardation until President Obama signed a law in 2010 changing that. But children with ID may take longer to learn to speak, walk, and take care of their personal needs, such as dressing or eating. They are likely to have trouble learning in school, but they will learn. It will take them longer. They can learn and they will learn. There may be some things that they cannot learn, but that repetition and the strategies that we employ are key. Let's dive deeper into what intellectual disability means. So this chart is called a bell curve, if you haven't seen it before. And if you have, you know that it's basically showing the population on this curve. And it's, in this case, it's showing, it's a bell curve of student skills. The largest percentage of the population fall in the average range, where you see all those little pictures of students in the middle range. Intellectual disability affects 1%, about 1% of the population. Of that 1%, about 85% are deemed to have mild intellectual disabilities. So how do we diagnose intellectual disabilities? We look at two main things: the ability of a person's brain to learn, think, solve problems, make sense of the world, what a lot of times we call IQ or intellectual functioning. And another large component of this is whether the person has the skills he or she needs to live independently. So it's called adaptive behavior or adaptive functioning. This entails daily living skills, communication skills, and social skills with peers, family members, adults, other people. So a student's personal strengths and weaknesses when we're talking about intellectual disabilities or any disability are key. I think you're starting to understand that. Knowing a student's strengths and weaknesses is key to their learning. This includes the amount of support or help the student needs to get along at home, in school, and in the community. This is extremely important for students who have an ID. This approach gives a realistic picture of each individual. It recognizes that a picture can change. And as the child grows and learns, his or her ability to get along in the world grows as well. Let's talk about some potential causes of intellectual disabilities. We know that a developmental disability is not a disease or a mental illness. It is not contagious, and it is not curable. there are many potential causes of developmental disabilities. In 40% of diagnosed cases, the cause is not even known. Some of the most common causes of ID are genetic conditions. Abnormal genes that are inherited from the parent or as a result of errors in the combination of genes when the baby is developing is one of the top causes. ID under this category may include Down syndrome, as well as Fragile X syndrome, or what we call PKU. Another cause could be gestational problems, problems during pregnancy. Other causes could be birth problems. The baby may not be getting enough oxygen. And when that happens, the chance of ID gets greatly increases. And then health issues. There are different diseases and health concerns that can lead to intellectual disabilities, such as measles, whooping cough, poisoning, malnutrition. These are some of the medical conditions that can result in ID. All right. So one of the conditions that we talked about, one of the genetic conditions that lead to ID is Down syndrome. A child with Down syndrome has an extra chromosome. Now, chromosomes are small bundles of genes that determine how a baby's body forms during pregnancy and how their body functions after birth. So typically, a baby is born with 46 chromosomes, but children with Down syndrome have an extra copy of one of these chromosomes. It's chromosome 21. This extra copy affects the baby's physical and mental development. So although children with Down syndrome might share some similarities in appearance and behavior, we have to remember that each child has different abilities. Very similar to that one slide with the rainbow that Naraina talked about regarding autism. Ooh. This is a little video I will not play, but again, going back to resources on YouTube, it's very cute. It's made in London, and students talking about things people with Down syndrome don't want to hear anymore. So when you get a chance, please listen to that in your own time. So how do we interact with a child with Down syndrome? Back in college, this was a very, very important lesson that we were taught about something called people first language. So if you haven't heard about this, I'm going to talk about it very briefly in how important it is regarding our language, not only when students are around, but with each other and with ourselves. May you be writing or speaking, the language that you use is extremely important in putting the person before the disability. Here's how. And you use my student with Down syndrome, or my student with intellectual disability, my student with autism, for any disability, not just ID, instead of my Downs kid or my autism kid. You would, or even saying he's Downs, you would put the student first or the person first, my student with Down syndrome. My student receives special education instead of saying he's a special ed student. Encourage all students to think of students with Down syndrome as people first, and just try really hard to stay away from stereotypes, especially with kids who have ID or Down syndrome. Oftentimes parents or people working with them will say, oh, they're so lovely. They're always so happy. They just always want to hug. These are all stereotypes, and children with Down syndrome experience a wide range of emotions and are not all alike. So good thing to remind each other and to remind yourself about people first language. How do children with Down syndrome or children who have ID learn? They are visual learners. So pairing pictures with spoken word is extremely important. Auditory memory and auditory processing is not a strength. So always please give them time to process information and allow extra time when they're responding. You want to make sure they have adequate response time. Fewer short-term memory channels. So it's going to be very, very important to break down directions into smaller steps. Repeat the directions. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Very small chunks of information at any given time. And just as with children who have autism and many other disabilities, students with Down syndrome are literal learners. So it's really important to avoid using any kind of slang or words that may have multiple meanings or multiple terms. And also, of course, give them time to learn, right? They learn at a slower rate than typical peers. So that repetition is going to be very important. All right, some continued supports on working with students with Down syndrome. Some of these we've already gone over, but repetition is great for us too. Using baby steps, chunking, start by breaking each lesson down into simple, to the most vital components that is needed. Second, incorporate more physical learning experiences. This is extremely important. That movement component in learning is huge. Role modeling, getting outside, allowing a student to learn using their physical items to manipulate. And then start a feedback book or a chart. Students with ID can greatly benefit from immediate and consistent feedback. So if you can create a book or a chart that creates a record of that feedback, allowing the student to look back and see how much they've developed right there in the book is extremely, extremely useful. And of course, music. Encourage music in the classroom. Music can be a vital part of learning and development for any student, but for kids who have ID, it can be especially powerful as a motivator to learn. Using music with concepts and lessons can help them retain information and offer greater engagement of the subject at hand. We've already talked a lot about how important it is to provide visual stimulus, whether it's simply drawing what you're talking about on the whiteboard or on a piece of paper, or describing it in more detail. Creating that visual is extremely important. And then lastly on this slide, repetition of the same material over time will help consolidate new learning and skills for many children with an intellectual disability. With an intellectual disability, such a common difficulty for many students, it's vital to ensure that they receive the same level of care and attention when it comes to their education as any other student. At the time, it's vital that teachers, educators, and parents work together to ensure they are providing the best environment for every student. Okay, let's talk a little bit about supporting their social integration. Redirecting student behavior and implementing behavior management plans. Having a strong classroom management plan is going to be crucial. Facilitate interaction between students with disabilities and peers. So this is the importance of mainstreaming. Teaching and modeling strategies to peers about how to interact with a student with a disability. Typically, developing peers need a lot of our support to know how to be around students who require this extra support. And support the development of communication skills. Children with ID may have poorly developed social skills and problems understanding things from each other from another person's perspective. Perspective taking is very challenging. So is social anxiety and sometimes poor articulation. Those communication skills that are needed to socialize can lead to a lot of conversational difficulties. So a lot of times you'll see students with ID acting a lot younger, or they're wanting to be with much younger children. And at times they might prefer to play with younger students, and that's okay. But please continue the role modeling and the performance feedback and just identifying the crucial skills that are needed for them. Okay, so here are some types of supports listed from most to least restrictive or intrusive. Think about the types of supports the students you work with get from you. Could it be more intrusive than they need? For example, direct oral versus indirect verbal directions. So this is when we're accommodating our students, when we're supporting them, when we're in the classroom trying to get them to learn or socialize. As important as that is, it is extremely important to figure out ways to create independence and increasing their independent skills. And if you're able to give a direction without using oral language and you can come up with a signal, that creates even more independence for them. So having our mind and our work ethic move toward increasing independence is going to be crucial, as well as considering how dependent students, especially with ID, become on adults to do all the tasks for them. But when they are adults, we want them to be able to function. And as we are coming to a close, these are just some strategies of what anybody who is in the classroom can be doing to support a teacher. For example, when the teacher is teaching a lecture, what a paraprofessional or support person could be doing. So review some of these. There are some good ideas there. And as we've said numerous times, they apply to all students. And the most important thing is to know your student and what strategies support them. And of course, to have your tools and strategies available to you. Hopefully, we have been able to support you with that.
So this brings us to the end of our presentation. We wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you learned a few new things from our presentation. We have a couple of additional slides here that we wanted to share with you. The first one has a few resources on autism spectrum disorder. And on the second slide, you'll find more resources on specific learning disabilities that we talked about, and also strategies for ID. So feel free to click on those links and get more information. Of course, we want to ask you to please visit the Armenian American School Psychology Association's website for more information. We also have other videos we've created on our YouTube channel. We're also, of course, on Instagram and Facebook, so connect with us. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, and check out our website. We have a lot of resources there as well. All the best.